The bullet meant for Lieutenant Commander Hayes missed his head by 3 inches. The crack of the round splitting air was so close, he felt the displacement pressure against his cheek before the sound registered. Another shot, this one sparking off the boulder he'd taken cover behind, sending granite fragments stinging across his exposed forearm. The SEAL team was pinned down in dense Pacific Northwest forest, surrounded by an enemy that shouldn't have existed, fighting a battle that wasn't supposed to happen, and the only person who could save them was the intelligence analyst they'd all dismissed as dead weight, right up until she pulled a Barrett M82 from her gear bag and changed everything. Before we show you exactly what happened in those 18 minutes that rewrote the definition of impossible, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what you're about to witness isn't just a story about marksmanship. It's about the moment a team of America's most elite warriors learned that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody's paying attention to. Now let's get into it. The insertion had gone smooth. Too smooth in hindsight. The MH-60 Blackhawk had dropped them at the coordinates just after midnight, rotors cutting through fog so thick it felt like flying through wet cotton. Staff Sergeant Eliza Cooper had been the last one out, her boots hitting moss-covered ground with barely a sound. She'd adjusted the pack on her shoulders, heavier than standard issue, heavier than anyone noticed, and fallen into formation without a word. The mission brief had been straightforward. Intelligence suggested that a domestic extremist cell was operating out of the Cascade Wilderness, stockpiling weapons and planning coordinated attacks on federal infrastructure. The SEALs were there to locate, surveil, and if necessary, neutralize the threat before it could metastasize into something worse. Cooper's role was strictly observational, intelligence asset, tactical analyst, someone to identify faces and confirm targets. She wasn't supposed to be part of the operational element. That was 4 hours ago. Now, as dawn light filtered through towering Douglas firs and western red cedars, the situation had deteriorated into something none of them had anticipated. The extremist cell wasn't just armed. They were trained, disciplined, and they'd been waiting. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes led the 8-man team through terrain that should have provided perfect cover. Dense undergrowth, natural defilade, limited sight lines that favored close-quarters tactics where SEALs excelled. But somewhere between the landing zone and their objective, they'd been spotted. Or maybe compromised before they'd even loaded onto the helicopter. Either way, the enemy had set a trap, and Hayes had walked his team straight into it. The first indication came when Petty Officer Chen, walking point, raised his fist. The column froze. Through the morning mist, movement, not animals, humans, and they were moving with tactical precision, flanking positions, weapons at the ready. Hayes keyed his radio. "Contact probable. Weapons tight until..." The forest erupted. Automatic weapons fire tore through the trees from 3 directions simultaneously. Bark exploded from trunks as rounds walked up the natural columns. Leaves and branches disintegrated in the crossfire. The SEALs scattered, taking cover behind whatever terrain features they could find, returning fire with controlled bursts that spoke of years of training, but they were outnumbered and outpositioned. The enemy had chosen their ground carefully, setting up interlocking fields of fire that turned the forest into a killing ground. Every time a SEAL tried to maneuver, rounds forced them back into cover. They weren't advancing. They weren't retreating. They were pinned. Cooper had gone to ground behind a massive fallen cedar, her M4 carbine up and tracking for targets. But unlike the others, she wasn't returning fire. She was analyzing, counting muzzle flashes, tracking firing patterns, building a mental map of enemy positions with the kind of systematic precision that comes from training most people never receive. "Cooper, get rounds down range." That was Petty Officer Reeves shouting from behind a boulder 15 meters to her left. She ignored him. There was something more important than adding her rifle to the suppressive fire. She needed to see the whole battlefield, understand the geometry of the trap they were in. Only then could she figure out how to break it. Hayes's voice crackled over the team radio, calm despite the chaos. "Panther 6 to all elements. We're in a prepared ambush. Enemy has high ground to our north and east. We need to break contact and withdraw to Rally Point Bravo. But when Chen tried to move, a burst of fire nearly took his head off. The enemy wasn't interested in letting them withdraw. This wasn't harassment. This was annihilation. They're using suppression teams, Cooper said, her voice cutting through the radio chatter with unexpected authority. 3-man elements. 1 suppresses while 2 maneuver. They're trying to flank us from the west. How do you know that? Hayes demanded, putting rounds into a tree line where he'd seen movement. Because that's what I would do. Her tone was matter of fact, no emotion, just tactical analysis delivered with the confidence of absolute certainty. Another burst of fire. This time it was Petty Officer Morrison who took a hit, the round punching through his plate carrier and knocking him backward. The ceramic plate had caught most of it, but he was down, gasping, potentially with broken ribs or worse. The situation was collapsing. Hayes knew it. His team knew it. They had maybe minutes before the enemy completed their flanking maneuver and rolled up the SEAL position from multiple directions. Close quarters in dense forest with an enemy that knew the terrain. That was a meat grinder nobody walked away from. That's when Cooper made her decision. She rolled away from the fallen cedar, low crawling through ferns and undergrowth back toward where they'd established their rally point. The rest of the team was too busy fighting to notice her movement. She reached the cache of gear they'd left behind, rucksacks, extra ammunition, specialized equipment, and pulled her own pack close. The zipper was military grade, designed to operate silently. She worked it open and withdrew something that made the morning light seem suddenly brighter. A Barrett M82, a 1.50 caliber sniper rifle. The weapon was a monster, 29 pounds unloaded, 4 feet long, chambered in a round originally designed for punching through engine blocks and light armor. It wasn't standard issue for intelligence analysts. It wasn't supposed to be in her possession at all. But there it was, matte black and deadly, with a Leupold Mark IV scope mounted on top and a suppressor that added another 14 inches to the already considerable length. She assembled it with movements that spoke of thousands of repetitions. Bipod deployed, magazine seated, bolt worked with precise mechanical efficiency. The weapon came alive in her hands, transforming from components into a tool of absolute lethality. Through the trees, the firefight continued, but Cooper had already moved beyond it mentally. She was calculating angles, measuring distances, reading the wind through the way it moved the canopy overhead. The forest was dense, but .50 caliber rounds didn't care about intervening foliage. At the velocities the Barrett generated, small branches and leaves were irrelevant. Only solid tree trunks mattered, and Cooper's mind was already plotting paths that threaded between them. She moved again, this time to a slight rise that gave her elevation and sight lines into the enemy positions. The Barrett's weight should have made her slow, clumsy. Instead, she glided through the undergrowth like smoke, finding a natural shooting position between 2 moss-covered boulders that provided concealment and stable support. The scope came up. Through the optic, the battlefield resolved into crystal clarity. Enemy positions that had been invisible to the naked eye stood out in sharp relief muzzle flashes, heat signatures, the subtle movement of camouflaged fighters who thought they were hidden. Cooper's breathing slowed, became measured and controlled. Her heart rate dropped through conscious effort, biofeedback training kicking in automatically. The Barrett's reticle settled on the first target, a fighter positioned behind a thick fir tree, using the trunk as cover while he directed fire at Hayes's position. The man thought he was safe. The tree was probably 2 feet in diameter, solid wood that would stop any conventional rifle round. But the Barrett wasn't conventional, and Cooper wasn't aiming at the tree. She was aiming through it. The physics were simple if you understood ballistics. A .50 BMG round, traveling at 2,800 feet per second with 13,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy, didn't stop when it hit organic material. It penetrated, creating a temporary wound cavity through solid wood that was catastrophic to anything on the other side. Cooper's finger found the trigger. The Barrett's break was crisp, predictable. She pressed through it with the kind of control that comes from muscle memory carved deep by repetition. The rifle roared. Even suppressed, the .50 caliber's report was massive, a sound like God's hammer striking an anvil. The recoil was substantial, but Cooper had braced for it, her body absorbing the impact through proper positioning and biomechanics. Downrange, the effect was immediate and dramatic. The round hit the fir tree, punched through 2 feet of solid wood, and emerged on the other side with enough remaining energy to find the man hiding behind it. He dropped without a sound, without warning, killed by a bullet that had come through supposedly solid cover, as if it were paper. The other enemy fighters didn't understand what had just happened. They saw one of their own fall, but the direction of fire was wrong. The angle made no sense. They were still scanning for threats along their established sight lines when Cooper's second shot hit. This target had positioned himself in a rocky depression, thinking the natural fortification made him invulnerable. Cooper put a round through the narrow gap between 2 boulders at an angle that required mathematical precision to calculate the bullet threaded through impossible space and found flesh with devastating effect. 2 down, 16 seconds between shots. The SEALs were still fighting, still pinned down, still unaware that their situation had fundamentally changed. But Hayes, with the instinct of a man who'd survived multiple combat tours, sensed something was different. The enemy fire pattern had shifted, become less coordinated. Confusion was bleeding into what had been disciplined tactical execution. Cooper worked methodically through her target priorities. A machine gunner who'd been suppressing Reeves's position, 1 round through the weapon itself, destroying the mechanism and sending fragments back into the operator. A team leader coordinating movement via radio, 1 round that ended the conversation permanently. An enemy sniper positioned in a tall pine, thinking elevation and concealment made him untouchable. 1 round that proved him wrong in the most final way possible. 5 targets. 90 seconds. The Barrett's magazine held 10 rounds. She was halfway through, and the enemy was starting to panic. They'd been attacking. Now they were the ones under fire, and they couldn't identify where the threats were coming from. The sound of the Barrett echoed through the forest, bouncing off trees and terrain, making directional assessment impossible. Reeves was the first SEAL to understand. He'd seen enough combat to recognize the distinctive report of a .50 caliber rifle, and he knew nobody on their team was supposed to have one. He risked a glance toward where Cooper had been positioned and saw nothing. Then he looked higher, toward the rise, and caught a glimpse of movement between the boulders. "Holy shit," he breathed. "Cooper's shooting." Hayes didn't have time to process that information. An enemy element was still trying to complete their flanking maneuver, 3 fighters moving through dead ground that would bring them into the SEAL's rear. He brought his rifle up to engage, but the angle was terrible, and they were using cover effectively. Then, one of the flanking fighters simply fell, like someone had cut his strings. A second later, the distinctive boom of the Barrett rolled through the forest. The other 2 fighters froze, unsure whether to advance, retreat, or seek better cover. Their hesitation cost them. Cooper's next 2 rounds found both men with surgical precision, threading between trees at angles that shouldn't have been possible. 8 targets down. 4 minutes elapsed. The enemy's tactical cohesion was collapsing. What had been a coordinated ambush was fragmenting into isolated individuals trying to survive. Some attempted to withdraw, falling back through the forest toward secondary positions. Others hunkered down behind whatever cover they could find, hoping to wait out the invisible threat that was systematically destroying their unit. Cooper tracked the retreating fighters through her scope. Long-range targets now, 800 meters and beyond, moving through dense forest, where conventional wisdom said precision fire was impossible. She compensated for wind, for elevation, for the angle of their movement, for the way bullets would deflect off branches and undergrowth. The Barrett spoke again and again. Each report was followed by a distant collapse, a life ended by mathematics and skill, and a weapon system that turned impossible shots into certainty. 10 targets. 12 minutes. Chen, the team's corpsman, was working on Morrison, stabilizing his injuries while the firefight raged around them. But he couldn't help but watch the forest. seeing enemy positions that had been directing murderous fire at them suddenly go silent, one after another, falling to an invisible reaper who struck with mechanical efficiency. "Who is that?" Chen asked, his voice carrying genuine awe. "Who the hell is shooting?" Hayes had figured it out. He was watching through his rifle scope, tracking the trajectory angles, working backward from where enemy fighters were falling to calculate the point of origin. It kept coming back to the same location, that rocky rise where Cooper had disappeared. "It's the analyst," he said, and his voice carried a mix of disbelief and respect. "It's fucking Cooper." The enemy was broken. Those who could withdraw were doing so, falling back through the forest in disorganized clusters that bore no resemblance to the disciplined tactical element that had ambushed the SEALs. Those who couldn't retreat had surrendered or were hiding, hoping to be overlooked. The firefight that had threatened to annihilate Hayes' team had lasted 18 minutes. From first shot to last, Cooper's intervention had consumed exactly 12 of those minutes. 10 confirmed kills, each one a target eliminated with precision that redefined what the SEALs thought was possible in dense forest conditions. She safed the Barrett, broke it down with the same mechanical efficiency she'd used to assemble it, and returned to the team's position as if nothing remarkable had happened. By the time she emerged from the tree line, the weapon was secured in its case, concealed in her pack, invisible once again. The SEALs stared at her like she'd appeared from another dimension. Hayes was the first to find words. "Cooper." He paused, searching for how to articulate questions that didn't seem to have adequate language. What the hell was that? She adjusted her pack, her expression as neutral as if she'd just returned from a supply run rather than single-handedly breaking an ambush. That was 10 hostile targets eliminated at ranges between 300 and 900 meters in a denied area with limited sight lines and significant foliage interference. "You're an intelligence analyst," Reeves said, still trying to reconcile what he'd witnessed with what he'd been told about their team composition. "I'm also a graduate of the Special Operations Target Interdiction course," Cooper replied. 3 years with Joint Special Operations Command. 47 confirmed kills across 17 operational deployments. They reassigned me to intelligence assessment 6 months ago after—" She stopped, seemed to reconsider what she was about to say. "After my last mission." Hayes studied her with the kind of intensity he usually reserved for enemy combatants. He was seeing her differently now, recognizing signs he should have caught earlier. The way she moved through terrain with perfect economy, how she'd positioned herself during the initial movement with sight lines and fields of fire already calculated. The fact that her pack had been 20 pounds heavier than standard issue, and nobody had questioned why. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked. "Because you didn't need to know," she said simply. "My role was intelligence assessment, observation analysis, unless circumstances required additional capabilities." "And when did you decide circumstances required your additional capabilities?" Cooper looked at him with eyes that had seen too much violence to pretend otherwise. "When Petty Officer Morrison took a round, and you were approximately 4 minutes from being overrun and killed." She said it without drama, just tactical assessment delivered with clinical precision. At that point, operational success required intervention with capabilities beyond what your team currently possessed. Chen had finished stabilizing Morrison and was checking the rest of the team for injuries. They'd been lucky. Morrison's broken ribs were the worst of it. In any other scenario, pinned down by a well-coordinated ambush in terrain that favored the enemy, casualties should have been catastrophic. But Cooper's intervention had changed those calculations, rewritten the expected outcome through precision, application of overwhelming force. "The Barrett," Hayes said. "That's not authorized equipment for intelligence assets." "It's not unauthorized either," Cooper replied with the barest hint of a smile. "The equipment authorization forms for JSOC personnel list mission-essential gear as determined by operational requirements. I determined it was mission-essential." "Did you know we were walking into an ambush?" That was Reeves, still processing the speed and precision with which she'd dismantled the enemy force. Cooper shook her head. No actionable intelligence suggested prepared enemy positions, but the tactical environment suggested contingency planning was appropriate. Dense forest, limited extraction options, domestic extremist cell with unknown training level and equipment capability. The probability matrix favored bringing additional capabilities. She pulled out her tablet, calling up satellite imagery of the area they'd been operating in. The enemy positions were well prepared. Pre-positioned fighting positions, coordinated fields of fire, radio communication between elements. This wasn't opportunistic. They knew we were coming. That sent a chill through the team. Compromised operations meant leaks, security breaches, problems that extended far beyond a single firefight in the Pacific Northwest. Hayes keyed his radio, switching to the command frequency. Panther 6 to Overwatch. Be advised, we encountered organized resistance at primary objective enemy force, displayed advanced knowledge of our insertion, request immediate extraction and security review of mission planning. The response came back within seconds. NMH-60 was already inbound, redirected from standby status. They had 20 minutes to reach the extraction point. The team formed up, Morrison supported between Chen and another operator. They moved through the forest differently now, with Cooper positioned where she could provide overwatch, the Barrett accessible within seconds if needed. The dynamic had shifted. She wasn't cargo anymore. She was the person you wanted between you and whatever threats the forest might still be hiding. They reached the extraction point without further contact. The enemy had withdrawn completely, unwilling to risk another engagement against an opponent who could reach out and kill them from impossible distances through cover they thought was solid. The Blackhawk settled into the clearing, rotors whipping undergrowth into swirling patterns. The team loaded quickly, professional even in their exhaustion. Cooper was last aboard, settling into a seat near the door where she could maintain situational awareness. As the helicopter lifted away from the forest floor, Hayes moved to sit across from her. The noise of the rotors made private conversation impossible, but he didn't need words. He extended his hand. Cooper looked at it for a moment, then accepted the handshake. It wasn't just acknowledgement. It was recognition, the kind that warriors extend to other warriors when words are inadequate to express respect earned through fire. The flight back to base took 40 minutes. Most of the team slept, bodies demanding recovery after the adrenaline dump of sustained combat. But Hayes stayed awake, watching Cooper with the kind of thoughtful intensity that came from reassessing everything he thought he understood. She'd saved their lives, not by being in the right place at the right time, but through deliberate preparation and capabilities that exceeded anything they'd been briefed to expect. She'd walked into a death trap with them, recognized the danger, deployed equipment she wasn't supposed to have, and executed a rescue with precision that most snipers couldn't achieve from prepared positions with perfect sight lines. And she'd done it like it was routine. The debrief lasted 6 hours. Cooper's after-action report was comprehensive, clinical, detailed. She described each shot with mathematical precision: range, wind, angle, target assessment, effect on target. The intelligence officers analyzing her report kept stopping, asking her to repeat details, struggling to reconcile what she was describing with what they understood about long-range precision fire in dense forest environments. "You're saying you made a 900-meter shot through foliage with a target that was moving?" The intelligence officer looked at her like she'd claimed to have flown to the target without a helicopter. "The target was moving at approximately 3 miles per hour on a predictable path," Cooper clarified. "I calculated his position 2 seconds ahead of his current location and placed the round where he would be, accounting for bullet flight time and deflection from intervening foliage. The .50 BMG maintained sufficient energy to defeat light obstacles and still achieve terminal ballistic effectiveness on target." Hayes watched this exchange with grim satisfaction. His team had nearly died because someone in the planning chain had underestimated both the enemy and the capabilities of the asset they had assigned to his team. But that asset had saved them anyway, despite being deliberately positioned where she couldn't contribute to the fight. After the debrief, he found Cooper in the armory, cleaning the Barrett with the kind of methodical precision she applied to everything. The weapon was field-stripped, each component receiving individual attention. "They're going to want to take that away from you," Hayes said, nodding toward the rifle. "They can try." Cooper didn't look up from her work. "But the moment they issue orders restricting my equipment loadout, I'll submit transfer papers. There are other units that understand the value of planning for capabilities beyond the minimum requirement. JSOC or private sector pays better, and they don't care about paperwork as much." She assembled the rifle with smooth efficiency, then broke it down again, running through the sequence one more time. "But I'd rather stay where the mission matters." Hayes sat down across from her, watching the ritual of maintenance that every warrior recognized. "Tell me about your last mission, the one that got you reassigned to intelligence." Cooper's hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work. "Target interdiction. High-value individual in denied territory. Everything went according to plan, right up until it didn't. My spotter took a round I had to carry him 4 kilometers through hostile territory while engaging multiple enemy elements. We both made it out, but..." She stopped, weighing how much to say. The assessment was that I'd displayed judgment issues by engaging instead of evading, that I'd prioritized my partner over mission completion. "You saved his life." "I did. But the mission objective escaped, and it took another 6 months to locate and neutralize him. Command decided that made me better suited for intelligence work than field operations, lower risk assessment of my decision-making capacity." Hayes understood what she wasn't saying. Some bureaucrat had decided that Cooper's loyalty to her partner was a liability rather than an asset, that her willingness to fight her way out rather than abandon a wounded teammate suggested she couldn't be trusted to make ruthless calculations when missions required them. It was exactly the kind of thinking that destroyed good operators. "For what it's worth," Hayes said, "you made the right call today. And if you want a recommendation for transfer back to JSOC or any other unit, you've got it. Nobody on my team will ever forget that you walked into hell to pull us out." Cooper finished reassembling the Barrett and secured it in its case. "Appreciate that, Commander. But I'm not ready to go back yet. There's something satisfying about intelligence work, seeing the bigger picture, understanding how all the pieces fit together. Maybe I needed the break from pulling triggers. Until today." "Until today," she agreed. "But that was different. That was necessary. There's a difference between choosing to be a warrior and recognizing when the situation requires it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 professionals who understood the weight of violence and the cost of capability. "The team's hitting the bar tonight," Hayes said finally. "Unofficial, off-base, the kind of establishment that doesn't ask questions about why military personnel need to drink heavily on a Wednesday night. You should come." Cooper smiled, the first genuine expression of emotion Hayes had seen from her. "Will there be questions about where I learned to shoot? Probably can you handle drunk SEALs being impressed?" "I've handled worse." The bar was exactly what Hayes had described, a dive establishment that had been serving military personnel since before most of the current team had been born. Dark wood, dim lighting, a jukebox playing rock music from decades past. The kind of place where you could drink in peace and nobody judged you for ordering whiskey at 3 in the afternoon. The SEALs had claimed a corner booth, spreading out with the casual authority of men who'd earned the right to take up space. They were on their 3rd round when Cooper arrived, dressed in civilian clothes that made her look even less like the combat operator she'd revealed herself to be. A cheer went up when they saw her. Not mocking, not ironic, genuine celebration. Reeves waved her over, sliding down to make room. Someone put a whiskey in front of her before she'd even sat down. "To Cooper," Chen raised his glass. "The analyst who forgot to analyze and just started shooting instead." The glasses clinked together. Cooper sipped her whiskey, accepting the tribute with quiet grace. "Serious question," Morrison said. His ribs were taped up tight, but he'd refused to stay in medical. "Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that? Because I've worked with some of the best long gun operators in the Navy, and what you did today, that was different." Cooper considered her answer carefully. "I had a teacher, former Marine Scout sniper who'd transitioned to contracted work. He believed that precision shooting was as much art as science, and that the weapon was just a tool. The real capability was in understanding physics, reading environmental conditions, and making calculations faster than conscious thought. And he taught you to shoot through trees. Reeves looked skeptical. He taught me that obstacles are relative. A .50 caliber round has so much kinetic energy that materials most people consider solid barriers are actually just temporary impediments. The key is understanding material density, calculating energy retention, and accepting that some shots will fail. But if you understand the physics well enough, more shots will succeed than people think is possible. Hayes leaned back, studying her with an expression that was part respect, part calculation. How many confirmed kills do you actually have? 47 before today, 57 now. She said it without pride or shame, just fact. Across multiple theaters, Afghanistan, Syria, several locations that don't officially exist in public record, average engagement distance was 700 meters. Longest shot was 1,400 meters in mountain conditions with 30-knot crosswinds. The SEALs processed this in silence. They'd been operating under the assumption that Cooper was support staff, someone to carry equipment and take notes while the real warriors did the real work. Finding out she'd been killing enemy combatants at ranges where most shooters couldn't even identify targets, that required a fundamental reassessment of who she was and what she represented. Why the hell did they pull you out of the field? That was Chen, articulating what everyone was thinking. Cooper's expression darkened slightly. Because I made a choice. My spotter was hit, bleeding out, and the mission called for me to maintain position and complete the objective. But if I'd done that, he would have died. So I broke off, engaged multiple enemy elements during extract, carried him 4 kilometers to an extraction point, and called in emergency medevac. He lived. The high-value target escaped and killed 17 more people before we could locate him again. Jesus Christ, Reeves breathed. And they punished you for that? They said I'd displayed poor judgment, that mission success should always override individual preservation, that my emotional attachment to my spotter had compromised my operational effectiveness. She took another sip of whiskey. Maybe they were right. Maybe 17 people died because I chose to save one. Bullshit! Hayes' voice was flat, definitive. You made the call any decent human being would make. The fact that command doesn't understand that says more about them than it does about you. The conversation shifted to other topics. War stories, near misses, the peculiar challenges of operating in different environments. But the underlying current had changed. Cooper wasn't the outsider anymore. She was one of them, accepted through the oldest military ritual, shared combat and mutual respect. As the evening wore on and the whiskey continued to flow, Morrison leaned close to Cooper, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. Thank you. For earlier. I know I was bleeding out and probably would have survived either way, but he struggled with the words. You changed the outcome. You saved my life and everyone else's. That matters. Cooper met his eyes, seeing the genuine gratitude there. You're welcome. But that's the job. We look after each other. That's the only thing that matters when everything else goes to hell. The team drank late into the night, cementing bonds forged in violence and validated through survival. When Cooper finally left, walking back toward base housing in the cool evening air, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. She felt like she belonged. The official report concluded that the enemy cell had been disrupted through coordinated tactical action by a Navy SEAL team operating in difficult terrain. Cooper's contribution was mentioned in the classified annex, 10 confirmed enemy casualties attributed to long-range precision fire that had broken the ambush and enabled the SEAL element to survive. But there was no mention of the Barrett, no reference to capabilities that exceeded her official role. The weapons she'd carried weren't listed in the equipment manifest, and nobody seemed interested in asking questions that might require uncomfortable answers. Sometimes, the military was content to accept positive outcomes without demanding explanations that might create bureaucratic complications. 6 weeks later, Cooper received new orders. transferred to a joint task force that specialized in high-risk personnel recovery operations. The posting required skills in intelligence analysis, tactical planning, and precision marksmanship. It was exactly the kind of assignment that recognized all her capabilities rather than forcing her to operate at a fraction of her potential. The orders included a personal note from Hayes. "Told you I'd get you back in the field. Welcome to the team." She packed her gear, including the Barrett, which still wasn't officially authorized but also wasn't officially prohibited, and prepared to move to her new assignment. As she secured the rifle in its case, she ran her hand along the cold metal, feeling the weight of the weapon that had saved lives and taken them. Some people were built for violence, not because they loved it, but because they understood it, because they'd trained until skill became instinct, until calculations happened faster than thought, until the weapon became an extension of will rather than a separate tool. Eliza Cooper was one of those people. And now, finally, she was going somewhere that understood what that meant. The SEALs never forgot what happened in that forest. Chen kept detailed notes about her shooting positions, studying the angles, and trying to replicate her ballistic calculations. Morrison recovered fully, and he made sure to tell anyone who would listen about the analyst who'd saved his life with shots that shouldn't have been possible. Reeves started carrying extra ammunition for .50 caliber weapons on missions, just in case Cooper showed up again and needed support. And Hayes, he made it his personal mission to ensure that any time a team needed someone who could turn impossible situations around through precision application of overwhelming force, Eliza Cooper's name came up in the planning discussions. Because sometimes the most important person on a mission isn't the team leader or the point man or the communication specialist. Sometimes it's the quiet professional in the back who's carrying capabilities. Nobody expects and expertise nobody appreciates, right up until the moment everything goes to hell and she turns out to be the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe. In a world where appearances matter more than capability, where credentials carry more weight than competence, it's easy to overlook the people who've earned their place through fire and blood and countless hours of training in conditions most people can't imagine. But smart leaders remember one critical lesson. Never underestimate the person who seems content to observe. Because sometimes they're not learning your job. They're deciding whether you're worth saving when the situation requires someone to step up and change the outcome through capability that exceeds every expectation. The wolf doesn't announce itself to the sheep. It watches, it waits, and when the moment requires it, it acts with precision that redefines what everyone thought was possible. Eliza Cooper understood that lesson better than most, and somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, in a forest that would always remember the day a SEAL team should have died but didn't, the trees still carried the scars of rounds that had traveled impossible distances and achieved impossible results. 10 targets, 12 minutes, 57 confirmed kills and counting. Some warriors fight from the front, loud and obvious and impossible to miss. Others operate from positions where nobody expects them, changing outcomes through capability that exists specifically because most people never see it coming. Both types are necessary. Both types are lethal. But only one type gets consistently underestimated, right up until the moment they prove that appearances have nothing to do with capability. And quiet professionals are often the most dangerous people in any room. Thanks for watching. Every woman has a story worth telling. Join us to hear them all.